Okay, in this video, we're going to be creating this looping galaxy animation that looks like we're flying through outer space really quickly, whether you want to call that like light speed, warp drive, whatever. It also happens to be the same week the James Webb Telescope released its first images, so it kind of works out pretty well. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, I can pull up the finished version here of what we're going to be working on so we can take a look at it. And this is it. So we have all these galaxies kind of scattered. They're flying towards the camera. There's some really nice motion blur. And really, this is a pretty easy setup. Um, Now, it's by no means perfect. It's certainly not realistic when it comes to the size and scale. That is kind of one of the biggest issue with this that I see, but it also helps keep it interesting and colorful. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, I'm going to start by creating a plane, and I'm going to rotate this plane so it's upwards and increase the segments, the width and height to 100 to give me plenty of little squares that will hopefully separate into our galaxies. I'm going to open my material manager, create a new redshift material. Now, when I hit this plus sign, it is going to create a redshift material because I have already gone in and switched my renderer to redshift. So make sure you do that. And then you can create this redshift material, though really you can do this with any renderer. And we're going to add a texture. And the texture we're going to add is actually this Hubble Ultra Deep Field image that you can download from online. So the address is right there, pretty easy to, remember. I'll try to put it in the video description, but you can just download it right from here. And though it is quite large, that does give us more resolution. So we're going to load that image into a texture node, which I will do right now. Perfect. And then connect this to the diffuse color property. Okay. Let's see, overall emission property and the overall opacity property. Okay. So all three of those connections is what we want. We also want to come in here now, go to the overall section and increase the emission weight to say 2. We may come back and adjust that, perhaps bring it down a bit, but that will work just fine for now. And then we're going to go ahead and apply this material. And I should call this Galaxies New. And really what that material does is illuminates our galaxies a bit. And by using that same image in the opacity channel, it's also going to get rid of the dark areas, leaving us with just the galaxies. And the reason we wanted so many polygons and increase the segment so much is to try and get these galaxies kind of inside of a square. Now you'll see they do go over a single square. They're in multiple squares, and that's kind of the next step here. And it's the most time consuming and tedious one, though really how much you want to do of this process is entirely up to you, because by kind of splitting these up as we're going to do to make sure we have galaxies inside a single polygon, it's not terribly noticeable if you use a lot of motion blur. Okay, so like I said, it's really up to you how much of this process you want to do, but I'll go ahead and show it for you. We need to make this plane editable. And then what I'm going to do is go into edge selection and use my live selection tool and just find some edges that are kind of in the way of this galaxy being in a single polygon. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to dissolve them. The shortcut key here, MN, can be very helpful to help speed this process up. And by deleting those edges, I now have just a single polygon that galaxy is on. And when we separate all these polygons, here in a second, this will make sure that this galaxy looks like a full galaxy and not just a partial galaxy like what would happen here. So I can go through and kind of keep doing this process. And like I said, how much of this you actually want to do is entirely up to you. I'm going to use that shortcut key MN. And so rather than watch me do this a whole bunch, what I have is one that's already done. And so that's exactly what we see here. Okay, so here's my finished one where I did go through and clean up quite a few more of these polygons, separated them. All right. So these galaxies are inside of a single polygon, like I said. Now, the only other thing I did on this one that I didn't do on the other one was I scaled it a little bit. So what I ended up doing is switching the tag here to cubic, okay, going into UV mode here, texture mode, and then scaling this down a little bit like you can see. Okay, and I believe I actually had to rotate. Actually, you shouldn't have to rotate if it's in the cubic projection, so never mind that. So that's what I did. And then just to kind of finish it off, what I did to change it from an actual projection to UVW mapping is I right-clicked on the material tag and chose generate UVW coordinates. Now, because this already has UVW coordinates and it's the projection in here set to UVW mapping, that is grayed out. So that was another couple steps I had to do with the material before we kind of get ready to move on and start setting this up and getting it going. So from here, what we need to do is separate all these individual polygons. And the way you do that is by selecting all of them by hitting Control or Command A, right-clicking in some empty space, and then we are looking for the disconnect option, and I'm going to go to the gears, the settings here, because I want to make sure preserve groups is unchecked. And it may not look like that does anything, but now what should happen is if you select, say, a single polygon, you should be able to move it individually. So these polygons have been split or disconnected from each other, and that's going to make this work when we go ahead and throw this in a fracture object now. So I'm going to have my object selected, holding down Alt or Option, and come over here to my MoGraph objects and find a fracture. Okay, I can turn off the lines here as well. All right, so we have our fracture, and now what we're going to do is add a random effector to scatter these. So I'm going to add my random effector. Once again, I have my fracture object selected, okay? And that way it automatically gets applied. And if you didn't have it selected, you can just grab the random effector and drag and drop it in there. Now, it didn't actually do anything other than just kind of randomly move this whole thing because I need to come into the fracture object and switch the mode from straight to explode segments. And once I've done that, now we can see that the galaxies have been separated. And you can see that the ones that we deleted the edges on look good, though we may run into a few that the edges don't look good. And ultimately, you know, like I said, this won't look that bad because we're going to have a lot of motion blur. Glow would help kind of hide some of this, but you can always kind of undo this by undoing the fracture, selecting the plane, selecting all the polygons, optimizing it, which will go through, let's see, where's optimize, and weld everything back together. And then you can go in and remove the edges and then disconnect again. So if you find there's a couple of obnoxious galaxies that you want to split up, you can go ahead easily and fix them. But now you can kind of see how we have our galaxy field here starting to take shape. And what I'll do is go into my random effector and just kind of scatter these a little bit. So let's just do like 400 on each axis. That should be enough. Okay. So we can see that's a pretty good amount. We may come back and change that later. Okay. And so now we have our first fracture object, and you can see just how many polygons we actually scattered there. It's kind of ridiculous. Okay. And what we're going to do now is with the fracture object selected, come over here to our objects and choose instance. So I'm going to create an instance, and I can make this a render instance even. Okay. And I'm going to come over here to the coordinates and move this negative 800 units. Okay. And the only reason I went with, oops, I'm not sure that was quite right. Interesting. The only reason why I went with negative 800 is because we made the random effector 400. And so that will very easily just kind of set this up for us so they're equally spaced apart. All right, so we get kind of 400 units or 400 centimeters worth of the galaxies from this, the fracture, and then the other 400 from the instant. So that's at negative 800. I'm going to duplicate this one more time and set this to positive 800. Okay, except I did 700, so don't do that. Okay, this also makes it much easier when it comes to making this loop because we have some very easy to work with numbers. Okay, and I just turned the random off to help with this setup as well as the camera creation. We can see once I turn that random back on, how everything looks. And you can see just once again how many little polygons and galaxies we have there. Okay, so for the camera, all right, what I'm going to do is just try and kind of get it right in front of our first set of galaxies here. And I'm going to create a camera. Okay, I'm going to look through this camera. And really what I want is the X to be 0, the Y to be 0, and the Z to be negative 800. And I'll set the rotations to 0 as well. I can turn on the random effector now. And I could come in and maybe adjust some of these values to turn them down. Like I don't necessarily need these to go, 400 wide if it's really only 300 that starts to kind of fill our field of view. Now I do want to be a bit careful though, because I need to make sure even the last one still kind of fills the view here. So I could figure out what instance I'm next to. All right, turn off the random. Okay, and see which instance we have. So I want to turn off that one. And let's see, hide this fracture. Oops, which hides the other one. But we can see if we're still filling our field of view. And it looks like we are for the most part. We'll have to keep an eye on that. So I can turn the other one back on, turn on my random. And now what I'm going to do with the camera is go to frame 0, and I'm going to keyframe its position and rotation. Okay, so that way we have those recorded. I'm then going to go to frame 90. Okay, and I'm going to set this to positive 800. Okay. So we have that. And ultimately, for this to loop, we need the first frame to look like the last frame. And it currently does not. So we still have some work to do. Okay. And just so we can kind of make sure everything is looking good. So we have this here. And it's going there. Okay. Oh, actually, I think this should only just go to frame 0. So let's do that. I think that was a little bit of a mistake initially. There we go. Perfect. That is much better. Now, these still don't look the same. Okay. And the reason for that is because at the very beginning here, we are seeing the back instance. Okay. We are seeing this one. Whereas at frame 90, we only see this one. Okay, so at frame 0, we see 2. At frame 90, we only see 1. And the way we're going to fix that is by selecting that instance and adding a display tag to it. So we can have that display tag there, and we're going to animate the visibility property. You'll see when I set this visibility property to 0, it disappears, and it will actually animate through all these different percentages, though the viewport will only show us 0 or 100. I actually just did a video on the display tag, so if you want to go check that out, I would highly recommend it. Okay, but let's go ahead and animate this. So at frame 0, I'll set the visibility to 0. Okay, and at 90, I'll set the visibility to 100%. Honestly, even 45 would work. Okay, so now if we look through our camera again, frame 0 looks the same as frame 90. Now we're still not quite there looping wise because um, of the movement on the camera. Okay, we still have the slow in, slow out that we get when we automatically keyframe something in Cinema 4D. Usually it's a good thing. In this case, not so much. So what we're going to do is open up our timeline, raise it up if we need to, find the camera, and I'm going to go into F-curve mode here. And we need to do two things. Okay, the first is make sure we have our keyframe selected for our camera. It should just be the Z position, so we can make sure we just have that selected. So select both of those keyframes, switch the keyframe type to linear, and that will do it for the camera movement, okay? But because we're gonna be adding motion blur, we also need to change one other thing in the camera. So select the Z position, and we need to switch the track before and track after, which is these guys here. Maybe I can do a video about those because they can be very helpful and important for creating looping animations. But what we can do is just set this to continue. And so what's going to happen before is that if we did have additional frames, it's going to continue that same movement, that same speed. And that's going to help us with motion blur. Same thing with at the end. If we were to extend this animation, the camera would still be moving at the same rate. So that should really finish it for getting this to loop. Okay, now what we need to do is adjust our render settings. So I'm going to turn on my random effector at this point just to kind of see what things look like. And since I'm going to be using Redshift, I'm going to start my IPR there. And this can take a second to get going, because we have so many polygons because we instance them. So, all right, this looks pretty good. I still maybe have a couple of galaxies I wish I'd gone back and fixed, but oh well. Remember, we did set the emission on this. So we could come in and adjust that. So I'm going to go to my finished material here, which should be named. So I'll take care of that issue, at least try to. All right, never mind. And go to the overall section and see that, yep, we have emission set to 2. But you can see that by setting this down to 1, how it can dull this a little bit, or at least you would if it updated for us. Okay, so I think it just did, unless my eyes deceived me when I looked away. Oops. So, all right, we have our material looking good. One thing we could do to this is to add some bloom. Okay, if you wanted to do this in camera, I would definitely recommend doing this in After Effects, but we're here, so why not? I'm going to add the Redshift camera tag to this camera. Go into bloom. And if I want to see bloom in my perspective view, this isn't necessarily the case if you're using the Redshift render view, but you want to make sure to turn on post effects. Okay, so now I can work with bloom in my perspective view here. I'm going to check override. I'm going to check enabled. This threshold here, I'm going to set to 2 since that's the amount of emission I have turned on. And now I can set the intensity here something higher. And we should start to see some of these start to glow. And I can go lower with this threshold as well. And that will eventually start to make some of these glow. And so I like that. Some glow more than others. It's not 100% uniform. And we could just kind of keep going with this until we are happy with it. But like I said, we're really better off doing this in After Effects or in post as opposed to in render. So that should do it for our animation. Next up is the motion blur, because if we were to render this right now, and I'll pull up my Redshift render view for this, it's going to look pretty good, but we're not going to get kind of the feeling of speed because we don't have any motion blur. Now, motion blur is something that will not show up in our IPR. Quite disappointing, but it's just kind of the way it is in Redshift. And so to add motion blur, what we need to do is go to our render settings. And you can start by, in the basic tab, just checking on motion blur. Okay, unfortunately, that's really not going to be enough. So we do need to go to the Advanced tab here. Okay, now we're going to kind of cheat the motion blur. Okay, and we should be able to see it a little bit if we hit the actual render icon. And we can render any frame because we did the track before, track afters, okay, and gave this a constant movement. But we should see a little bit of motion blur, just even as is. Now, it won't be as extreme as the finished version, though, but maybe that's what you want. Okay, so I can see we have a little bit, especially out to the sides here. And if that's all you want, great, you're done. If you want more, what you need to do is switch to the advanced section here, go to motion blur, and what we're going to do is increase the frame duration. Now, how high you want to take this is entirely up to you. I think I used 4 in the example I showed you at the beginning of the video. And so I'll just use that again and we'll see the difference. I should have saved that. Can I still save it? Perfect. I think I took the snapshot in time. We'll now see kind of what the finished one looks like. And I can already tell we got more motion blur here. Okay. But once again, it just kind of depends on the look you're going for. Oh, looks like I saved. Nope, they're different. More motion blur or less motion blur. Now, one last thing you can do, okay, is we could send this over to Magic Bullet Looks. So if we open up our global settings, check Magic Bullet Looks on, open Magic Bullet Looks, I believe it'll send this image directly over. If not, we'll just save it to the picture viewer and do that. Okay, so yeah, nope, it did not take our rendered image. So let's just save this to the picture viewer. And unfortunately, it won't apply Magic Bullet Looks to or at least I haven't had any luck getting it to apply to an entire animation that's already rendered. So we'll just do it to this one frame. And let's see, where do they move it to now? There it is, File, Send to Magic Bullet Looks. So now we should have our rendered image there. And we can kind of get some interesting things, depending on what you are looking for. Sometimes, let's see, bookworm I actually think looks pretty good. I wish we had a little bit more of kind of a glow. I mean, we could even do a star filter. Maybe one of the times it kind of makes sense to add a little bit of a star filter here. Or perhaps, let's see, what else can we do? Anamorphic flare, I don't think that's what we want. I'm not sure. Yeah, the haze flare perhaps as well. I think maybe anamorphic flare is what I want. And we could just kind of keep playing with this. Oh, maybe not. No, that is definitely no good. Until we find something we like. And once again, I still would probably pull this into After Effects, use some kind of specific glow on that. Optical glow would be my go-to, but can certainly be helpful for creating something interesting directly in your render. And so with that, once you render out the entire animation, this is what you should have, or something very, very similar. So that's what I got for this video. Let me know if there's anything else you want to see. This was a little bit different as I, did a project as opposed to kind of showing you a tool or technique. So if you'd like to see more of these types of videos, let me know and I can see what I can do.